I've been a forest ranger for over a decade. I love my job. There's a kind of peace out here you don't find anywhere else. But the forest has its own set of rules, its own way of reminding you that you are the outsider. What I experienced last fall was one of those times. I don't tell this story lightly. In fact, I hesitated even bringing it up at all, but I think sharing my story could caution somebody finding themselves in the same situation. If you do, you must leave the area immediately, as quickly as possible. That day, I was on my usual patrol. Most of the time it was routine work, checking trails, clearing debris, making sure careless campers didn't burn down half the forest. Sometimes it was search and rescue, people who thought they could handle the wilderness until it proved them wrong. That afternoon, I was covering a remote stretch of forest near the mountain ridges. It wasn't a popular spot, too far from the main trails, too dense for casual hikers. But every so often, someone wandered too far, and it was my job to bring them back. Then the call came in about a missing camper. A man in his 40s on a solo trip hadn't checked in. His last known location put him somewhere near an old fire road, so I adjusted my course and headed that way. The hike was uneventful at first, crisp autumn air, golden light filtering through the canopy. The usual rustlings of birds and squirrels in the underbrush. Then, about 2 hours in, as the light began to fade, I felt it. That sudden, unnatural silence. No wind, no birds, not even the distant chatter of insects. I stopped in my tracks, listening for any sound. It is so unusual for the forest to get this quiet. It's never quiet, but now it felt as if the woods were holding their breath. I've only felt that kind of silence a few times before, but you could still hear the wind, small animals scurrying, or birds flying off, usually when a predator is nearby. But this was different. This wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else. Then I caught the smell of what seemed to be rot, wet, or something decaying. It wasn't the usual musk of a dead animal. It was worse. Like meat left in the sun too long. I swallowed against the nausea and moved forward thinking there must be some dead animal nearby. I walked slower now, my hand resting on the grip of my radio. A few feet away I saw a blue backpack, half-zipped, lying abandoned in the middle of the trail. I stepped closer to check it and there were clothes inside, a water bottle, but no sign of struggle, no blood. "Ranger Matthews to base," I said into the radio. "I found the missing camper's pack. No sign of him yet, but..." I stopped talking as I heard a twig snap close by, the sharp crack echoing through the unnaturally silent forest. I turned sharply, expecting to see the camper, or maybe even a bear, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees fading into the quickly dimming daylight. The silence was still there, thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Then, just as I started to take a step forward, I heard another sound. It wasn't the steady rhythm of footsteps. It was something mimicking footsteps. A pause, then a deliberate shuffle. Another pause. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stayed in my spot, swept my flashlight around but saw nothing. A chill crawled down my spine, and every instinct in me screamed that I needed to leave. My breath felt tight in my chest, but I forced myself to reach for my radio, fingers fumbling slightly as I tried to press the button. Before I could speak, a voice broke the silence. It was a man's voice, weak, trembling, barely above a whisper, coming from somewhere up ahead. "Hello. Help. Please." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The camper was alive. "I hear you. Stay where you are." I shouted in the direction of the voice, immediately moving toward the sound, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of him. I picked up my pace, pushing through the underbrush. The voice was just beyond a small clearing, weak but insistently asking anybody to help. Branches scratched at my arms as I pushed forward, the cold seeping deeper into my skin, but I kept moving, calling out again. Almost there. And then the voice changed. The same words repeated over and over, the same desperate tone. But something was off. It was subtle at first, like an old recording played just a little too slow. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air had turned thick with a stench of something rotting and decaying. I swallowed against the nausea rising in my throat and swept my flashlight forward. That's when I saw something moving through the trees just beyond the clearing. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its joints bent at angles that made my stomach turn. The head was smooth, almost featureless, except for a wide, slack mouth that seemed too large for its face, and it was watching me. I stood frozen, every muscle locked in place, my own breath caught in my throat, and for a second my mind had gone completely blank. Then, in a voice that made my blood turn to ice, "I hear you. Stay where you are. I'm coming." It was my voice coming from that creature. It had mimicked me. That was all it took. My body finally caught up with my brain, and I bolted. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't stop, didn't look back. But I heard it following behind me. I tore through the trees, my lungs burning, my mind screaming at me to just keep going. The silence had shattered now. Something was clicking, deep and rhythmic, like an insect's chittering, but far too loud. I had gone slightly off track when following the creature's voice, but I knew where I was, and finally I saw a break in the trees leading back to the old fire road. I didn't think. Instead, I pushed myself faster, leaping down the slope, and nearly losing my footing as I hit the gravel. My truck was just a few hundred yards ahead. Not once did I look back. I just ran. And then, at some point, the clicking started to fade. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and slammed the key into the ignition. The headlights flickered on. And there it was, just at the tree line, a pair of eyes like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. It was Toll, just standing there, limbs too long, head tilted slightly as it watched me. I didn't wait, and floored it, speeding down the road, my pulse hammering. I didn't slow down until I saw the ranger station lights ahead. We found the missing camper's remains a week later. Or what was left of him. I never saw that creature again, and I never wanted to. But sometimes, I still have nightmares about it, waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, screaming before I even realize I'm awake. But sometimes, on patrol, I'll feel it. That silence, that watching, and when I do, I turn around, and I leave.